reason I'm late.
Does he want to come in? Sir? Does he want TSA to testify?
We'll call the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure to order. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F and House Rule 11, Clause 2 HF, the chairman may postpone further proceedings today on any question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment which a recorded vote of the yeas and nays are ordered. And I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's meeting. Without objection, that is so ordered. All bill and amendment texts have been distributed electronically, and paper copies are also available here in the hearing room. And finally, I'd ask unanimous consent for the committee to use an amendments roster for any items under consideration by the committee. And without objection, that is also so ordered. We almost had the electronic or our new voting system in place, but we aren't going to have it in this markup, but it will be here for the January markup. So that is good news. Today, the committee is considering one measure and finishing the postponed vote on two measures. An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, promoting innovation in pipeline efficiency and safety act of 2023. Also, the postponed final passage of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6276, utilizing space efficiency and improving technologies of 2023, and the postponed final passage of H.R. 6278, maximizing office value and efficiency act of 2023. Our next item for consideration is going to be H.R. 6494, the Pipes Act of 2023. On it, I ask unanimous consent to discharge the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials for further consideration of H.R. 6494, and without objection, that is so ordered. I now call up the bill for consideration. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. The bill is now considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I'd recognize myself to offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Chairman Graves of Missouri.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for a statement. First, I want to express my appreciation to Ranking Member Larson, to Chairman Nels, and Ranking Member Payne for their contributions in reaching what I believe is a good bipartisan bill to promote the safety and efficient development of and deployment of American energy. And I appreciate the efforts of all the committee members and staff who contributed to the development of this bill. The United States is blessed with abundant energy resources, and its capacities for technological innovation remain unrivaled. The advent of new technologies and processes make it possible to safely and affordably produce and transport vast quantities of American energy, reversing the production declines that we have seen in the past. Early in my congressional career, the United States charted a goal to be a net energy exporter, which we achieved in 2019. Unfortunately, a lot of that progress has been under assault recently. So this bill before us today is a 4-year reauthorization of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration's, PHMSA, PHMSA's pipeline safety program that keeps PHMSA focused on the safety mission. Pipelines remain the safest and most economically efficient means of delivering oil and natural gas and increasing the volume of future fuels like hydrogen into the market. This bill ensures the right balance between environmentally friendly United States production and the safe transportation of our energy resources, which ensures that the United States is going to remain competitive, a global leader in the production and exportation of new energy resources such as hydrogen and in environmental protection. It also includes a long-sought voluntary information sharing program, which is similar to that used by airline pilots and the FAA. And I want to commend Mr. Molinaro for his leadership on pushing for this important provision, and I'm glad to see that it was included in this bill before us today. Again, I want to thank Ranking Member Larson, Chairman Nels, and Ranking Member Payne for their hard work in putting together the Pipes Act of 2023, and I'd urge my colleagues to please support the legislation. I now recognize Mr. Larson for a statement.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm pleased to support the Promoting Innovation in Pipeline Efficiency and Safety Act of 2023 bipartisan bill that will advance pipeline safety. I want to thank the Chair of the committee. I want to thank the Chair of the Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee Chair Nels and Ranking Member Payne as well for their insights and collaboration in drafting this legislation. Since the tragic 1999 pipeline explosion in Bellingham, Washington, in my district that killed 3 young people, I've been working to ensure that hazardous products carried by pipelines stay in the pipelines. Unfortunately, that tragedy was not an isolated incident. The Pipeline Safety Trust, created in the wake of that Bellingham tragedy as a voice for public safety, testified before the committee in March that in the 2 years since the Congress passed the Pipes Act of 2020, there had been more than 1,300 reportable pipeline failures, more than one per day. 74 people have either been killed or injured to the point of inpatient hospitalization, and nearly $1 billion of property damage occurred. Since our hearing, a UGI natural gas explosion in West Reading, Pennsylvania killed 7 people, injured another 11 people, and displaced 3 families. The Panther Operating Company pipeline spilled over 1 million gallons of oil in the Gulf of Mexico near Venice, Louisiana. There have been many other pipeline incidents this year, including a BP oil spill at a campground in Branch County, Michigan, a TC Energy pipeline explosion at Shenandoah Civil War battlefield that closed down Virginia's Interstate 81, and an explosion of a Targa pipeline in Pearsall, Texas, southwest of San Antonio that killed 1 and injured 2. Avoiding these deadly accidents and protecting the health and the safety of the people and the environment is why Congress does this particular work. This bill represents the collective ideas that the committee gathered from our members, industry stakeholders, and pipeline safety advocates. It's a product that we can be proud of, that protects our communities and helps to combat climate change. This bill ensures the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, and state pipeline safety programs have the resources they need, that they prepare for an emerging pipeline infrastructure, and holds pipeline operators accountable and increases transparency. The bill provides $1.1 billion in funding over 4 years for PHMSA's pipeline safety activities, including an increase of $56 million for state pipeline safety programs. States are responsible for most pipeline safety inspections, and this bill ensures they have the resources they need to implement safety regulations. I want to thank Ranking Member Payne Jr. for his leadership on this particular issue. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act include more than $9 billion to invest in CO2 and hydrogen pipeline infrastructure as part of a plan to combat climate change. Our bill ensures the pipelines built to support this infrastructure growth will be governed by effective and comprehensive safety regulations. The bill requires a rulemaking to ensure PHMSA oversees the safety of pipelines used for transporting gaseous carbon dioxide, including those that will support sequester locations. The bill also requires a study of the safety of hydrogen blending applications and allows for rulemaking on hydrogen and hydrogen natural gas blending to support the build-out of hydrogen infrastructure. An effective safety regulation of hydrogen is particularly important in my home state of Washington, which was recently selected as a regional clean hydrogen hub. The Pacific Northwest Hydrogen Hub is eligible for up to $1 billion in federal funding from the Department of Energy over 4 development phases spanning 9 years. This bill holds the over 3,000 pipeline operators in Operation Day accountable for following safety rules, and it increases the maximum civil penalty for safety violations by 25%. The committee heard testimony from the Pipeline Safety Trust expressing concern that the additional safety considerations required by integrity management regulations are not working as intended, since pipeline incidents have continued to occur at around the same rate over the last 20 years in areas subject to integrity management regulations. So this bill requires the national academies to convene the nation's pipeline safety experts to evaluate whether changes to integrity management requirements are necessary and to make recommendations to improve them. This bill also promotes proactive engagement between pipeline stakeholders and the public on pipeline safety. I want to say thanks to Representative Strickland from my home state for your advocacy to create an Office of Public Engagement to educate local governments, public safety organizations, pipeline operators, and the public about pipeline safety, best practices, and regulations. And the bill also requires PHMSA to assess how pipeline operators engage the public on pipeline safety and emergency response planning, and allows PHMSA to create guidance to improve pipeline safety information sharing with the public. Further, the bill supports creation of a localized emergency alert system to warn the public in the event of a pipeline incident. We learned from the 2020 carbon dioxide pipeline rupture in Satartia, Mississippi, the importance of making communities and the first responders know products are moving through pipelines in their communities and how to remain safe in the event of emergency. So in closing, Mr. Chair, the PIPES 2023 bill increases the safety of our nation's pipeline infrastructure and establishes guidelines to avoid tragedies like the explosion in Bellingham. in 1999 and the rupture in Satartia and hundreds of annual pipeline incidents. I encourage my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill, and I look forward to your continued collaboration as it moves beyond committee. With that, I yield back.
I now yield to Mr. Nels, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The United States is blessed with abundant energy resources. We are the global leader in the production of oil and gas, and my home state of Texas remains a leading state in energy production from all sources. In Texas alone, the oil and gas pipeline industry generates over $60.5 billion in economic output, more than 243,000 jobs, and generates nearly $3.6 billion in state and local government revenue. This outcome is testament to the superior resourcefulness, technological prowess, and the entrepreneurial spirits of American enterprise. It's called capitalism. In addition, what few people outside my state know, and most progressives anywhere won't accept, is that Texas is also our nation's leader in the development and deployment of renewable energy resources. However, Texans also know, understand, and accept that renewable energy still faces substantial technological and practical challenges that limit its abilities to supplant the oil and gas our state and nation need for safe, reliable, secure, and affordable energy. These limits cannot be overcome through wishful thinking and socialist-style government schemes. They must be solved by science and market-based forces. The bill before us is about how we can better ensure the safe transportation of our energy abundance to end users and consumers. And it does it. It does it in several ways. It makes important strides in helping reduce regulatory overreach, protects our pipeline infrastructure and workers from the dangerous acts of radical environmentalists, ensures agency resources and activities remain focused on its core mission, and enables the advancement of new energy resources like hydrogen and the build-out of pipelines for carbon dioxide utilization and storage. Again, I want to thank Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and Ranking Member Payne for all of their work in putting this legislation together. I urge all my colleagues to support this bill. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Payne, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first, I'd like to thank Ranking Member Larson and Chairman Nels for working in a bipartisan manner to appeal a safer pipeline network across the United States. This bill is a product of discussions and negotiations between majority members and staff. Both sides had tough discussions over the past few months on various provisions in this bill. But I believe we have a product here that is amicable to all parties and hopefully will be reported out of this committee favorably with broad support later today. Because of these hard-fought negotiations, I plan to play my part in the Four Corners agreement reached with the majority as we prepared to consider amendments shortly. The Promoting Innovation in Pipeline Efficiency and Safety Act reauthorizes the Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration Pipeline Safety Program at $1.1 billion over the next 4 years, a total increase of $143 million. This additional funding is needed for PHMSA to hire additional personnel to carry out the agency's responsibilities to conduct oversight over the 3.4 million miles of pipelines that carry natural gas, petroleum, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and other hazardous gases and liquids to communities nationwide. The bill also directs PHMSA to review and address the current criteria for determining how high pollution areas are determined in their regulations. These changes would increase the safety in densely populated areas of our country, such as New Jersey's 10th Congressional District. Additionally, the bill allows PHMSA to regulate carbon dioxide pipelines more effectively and support additional methods to contain greenhouse gases such as carbon capture and carbon sequestration. Finally, this bill would expand resources for pipeline workforce training programs by waiving the cost-sharing requirement for small and mid-sized colleges and in universities to participate in PHMSA's Competitive Academic Agreement Program, which supports academic research on pipeline safety and helps educate and develop the future pipeline safety workforce. This change would enable every historically black college, university, along with most minority-serving institutions, to participate in this program and help diversify the pipeline of talent in the next generation has to offer for pipeline safety industry. The bill has many provisions. One, it improves transparency between PHMSA pipeline operators and our other stakeholders. Two, it increases the maximum civil penalty for safety violations by an operator by 25%. And three, it directs PHMSA to conduct various studies to ensure that we are moving in the right direction in building out a safe, equitable, and reliable pipeline network nationwide. Again, I want to applaud my colleagues for working in a bipartisan manner on this legislation, and I hope that upon the completion of this comprehensive pipeline safety bill, we can look forward to doing the same on rail safety legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Perry, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the last 2 decades, there has been a drive to facilitate carbon capture and storage projects where industrial plants capture, transport, and store CO2 before it ever enters the atmosphere. Yet there has been minimal uptake in these projects because they're extremely costly and produce few real benefits beyond regulatory compliance. And I got to diverge there a little bit because I say produce few real benefits. I actually didn't think they produced any, but they do produce one, and I'm going to talk about that. But in other words, but for the overbearing regulatory requirements imposed by those who seek to end the use of fossil fuels altogether, there would be little need and little value to these projects. Ironically, the one value they do add is to facilitate enhanced oil recovery, which does produce market value but undercuts the stated reasons for these projects. Even with the benefits of regulatory compliance for compliance's sake, these projects are not economically viable. Rather than accept that these fantasy projects are boondoggles that have failed to catch on despite 2 decades of attempts, Congress decided the best approach was to throw helicopter money at these projects and simply hope for the best. The IIJA and IRA have provided significant federal government resources to drive the expansion and completion of these projects under the misguided belief that we need to reduce carbon emissions. This has led to attempts by ethanol facilities to use eminent domain to produce pipelines that serve no purpose other than to produce the appearance of low carbon intensity fuels. Section 25 of this bill further facilitates these projects by taking precious PHMSA resources away from natural gas and oil pipelines and diverting them towards these projects that exist not due to market forces, but as a result of the ham-fisted regulatory burdens placed on an industry by the federal government pursuant to a radical climate agenda. While industry may view these projects as cost of doing business under this oppressive regulatory regime, the end result will be higher costs to consumers as resources are directed away from projects that produce market value to regulatory compliance sinks. Rather than seeking to further this insanity, and it's just complete insanity and driving up the cost for our consumers, that's what it does. That is irrefutable. We should be working to eliminate these unnecessary, destructive regulatory burdens placed on industry and allow them to meet the needs of our constituents at the lowest and safest cost point. Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance.
Mr. Bost, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to take the time to thank the chair and ranking member of the full committee as well as the subcommittee for including the language from the Pipeline Sabotage and Accident Prevention Act in this bill. This language will finally close a loophole allowing allowing terrorists and protesters to put communities and workers' lives at risk. In 2018, a judge in Minnesota let 2 women walk based on this loophole, and the 2 women intentionally turned valves to shut down a pipeline. The judge said that their action only disrupted the pipeline. The language fixes the problem and by defining the penalties for causing a deficit in or disturbing the operation of a pipeline. Actions as simple as turning a valve are a direct threat to human life, our environment, property, and economy. Our work together will continue to lead towards ensuring malicious actions against the safe operation of pipelines will be penalized. When we've gone as far as having movies titled "How to Blow Up a Pipeline," I think it's clear that pipeline fuel industry is under attack, and it's time that we close this loophole and punish these criminals. Thank you again for including this language in the bill, and I urge the support. I yield back.
All right. Moving on, I now recognize myself for a manager's amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I have it at the desk. Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Chairman Graves of Missouri, number 101.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. I obviously support the manager's amendment and appreciate the work of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle on this. This amendment contains some minor technical corrections along with policy changes that strengthen the existing bill by further supporting pipeline safety without creating challenging burdens on communities and the pipeline industry. In the same fashion as the introduced bill, this amendment also was negotiated and agreed to in a bipartisan manner, and I want to thank Ranking Member Larson for working with us on this. And with that, I yield back and recognize Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Chair. I support the manager's amendment. You've sponsored. It makes technical changes, as you noted, and incorporates several bipartisan member priorities. In the interest of time, I will just ask folks to support this amendment. There was a lot of good staff work that went into last night to make this manager's amendment happen, and I think it's worth voting for to ask folks to support it. I yield back.
Are there any further speakers on this amendment? Mr. Nels.
Mr. Chairman, I also support the manager's amendment and appreciate the work on both sides of the aisle that went into this. The manager's amendment provides additional technical clarity and context, as well as incorporates key policy improvements from members of the committee. Importantly, the manager's amendment strengthens the bill's language on excavation damage prevention to further prevent accidents due to mistakenly digging into a pipeline. Since 2003, there have been over 13,000 excavation damage incidents in the United States that resulted in over 1,100 injuries, 289 fatalities, and nearly $14 billion in property damage. This bill and the manager's amendment will provide support and improvements to excavation damage prevention efforts that will reduce preventable incidents, improve safety, and save lives. And I support this amendment. I yield back, sir.
Mr. Graves, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank you and Ranking Member Larson for working with us on on an amendment to this legislation that we worked on with Congresswoman Peltola. What it does is it simply mandates a strengthening of safety alternatives, where it brings in risk-based approaches, where it allows for more innovation, and I think is going to result in improved worker safety and ultimately an improved performance as a result of better inspection technology for breakout tanks. There are over 8,500 of these around the United States. They serve as sort of an interim capacity for pipelines. Unfortunately, PHMSA has been dragging their feet on applying improved standards that EPA, for example, has adopted. So our amendment simply comes in and ensures an equivalent level of safety, but does mandate that PHMSA use these risk-based analysis and alternative means of compliance that is equal or improved levels of safety, once again, that EPA has even adopted. So I just want to thank you for that. Yield back.
Mr. Moulton, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to speak in favor overall of the Pipes Act, and in particular this manager's amendment. Now, of course, the Pipes Act includes a provision. I worked with you and the ranking member in a bipartisan fashion to see included in the bill. It establishes a voluntary information sharing system. Now, this bipartisan initiative will proactively address and prevent gas pipeline leaks, improving environmental protection, and assisting in preventing and responding to emergencies. Specifically, Americans and upstate New Yorkers living in metropolitan areas like Binghamton, New York, for instance, live in close proximity to natural gas pipelines and hazardous liquid pipes. The establishment of a voluntary information system, sharing system, will encourage pipeline operators to work with and not against the regulators. Now, by fostering this collaboration, we will create a system that collects and analyzes crucial pipeline safety data, enabling us to take preventative measures to reduce the environmental impact of these vital pipelines. I'm also glad to see inclusion in my bill the Hydrogen Safety and Environmental Responsibility Act. And now this bill will require PHMSA to undergo a rulemaking to allow for the use of composite pipeline materials for the safe transport of hydrogen and hydrogen blended with natural gas. I personally support an all-of-the-above approach to energy, and hydrogen is a great clean energy resource that will help us to further diversify America's energy portfolio. This amendment is not only pro-environment, it's pro-consumer and pro-labor. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for working with me to secure the inclusion of these important provisions, and with that, I yield back.
Mr. Moulton.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Today's markup hits close to home. About 5 years ago, my district experienced the devastating consequences of a pipeline mistake. On September 13th, 2018, a pipeline in the Merrimack Valley, a region in my district, became overpressurized, causing 3 explosions, triggering dozens of structure fires and leaving at least 19 homes permanently uninhabitable. Thousands of my constituents were forced to immediately evacuate. When I arrived in North Andover, on the night of these explosions, the devastation was obvious. You could see it. The gaping holes that explosions had left in houses, the smell of smoke hanging in the night air, and the stricken faces of the affected families. Lionel Rondon was only 18 years old, but that disaster ended his life. 25 others were injured, and more than 8,000 people were forced to move out of their homes. The Merrimack Valley explosions should have never happened. They were caused by a mistake, an overpressurized gas line. The distribution lines were pressurized at 0.5 psi, while the main line was incorrectly overpressurized to 75 psi. This forced the high-pressure gas to enter the low-pressure distribution lines, causing a gas buildup in homes, which exploded and caught fire. I mean, just imagine the scene. Literally a whole stretch of towns with homes exploding as he drove down the street. To prevent a similar catastrophe from ever happening again, I worked with my colleagues in the Massachusetts delegation to pass the Lionel Rondon Pipeline Safety Act into law in 2020. Named in Lionel's memory, the bill is designed to stop similar disasters before they ever begin by creating significant reforms to pipeline safety standards to prevent a similar tragedy in the future. The bill requires the use of qualified employees like professional engineers to approve gas engineering plans and mandates on-site monitoring of gas system pressure by qualified employees during construction, among other provisions. This summer, PHMSA announced a rulemaking on the gas distribution rule to try and fix the problems that caused the explosions in Massachusetts. This proposal would improve construction procedures, increase gas line monitoring, and strengthen emergency response plans, all to minimize the risk of system overpressurization. It's good news that the PHMSA is actively addressing these vulnerabilities because lives are literally at stake when these mistakes are made. I'm grateful that the Pipes Act will give PHMSA the resources needed to advance the rule. We must continue to prioritize safety so that other communities don't have to experience the disaster in the Merrimack Valley 5 years ago. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Are there any further speakers on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Moving on to further amendments. For what purpose does Mr. Huffman wish to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, number 063.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Huffman, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you would never know from looking at this bill and hearing most of the debate today that we are in the middle of a worsening climate crisis that is wrecking the planet and threatening the very livability of this planet for future generations, including some current generations. PHMSA reauthorization could be a really important opportunity to reconcile our stated commitment to addressing this climate crisis with all of the fossil fuel business as usual that we continue to support, including the build-out of all kinds of fossil fuel infrastructure, which is really what this bill is all about. When you do that, you are enabling the fossil fuel industry to drill and burn and pollute more at a time when all of the science tells us we have to phase out this fossil fuel pollution, at a time when organizations like the IEA, not exactly radical environmentalists, are saying you have to stop building fossil fuel infrastructure if you want to preserve a livable planet. But unfortunately, this bill is missing that opportunity. I wish my colleagues across the aisle and some of my colleagues in my party would join me in this effort, but I don't think that's going to happen today. I will say I do agree with Mr. Perry on one thing. He is spot on in his description of CO2 pipelines. This is, he called it a fantasy. He is exactly right. He said the only point of this is to support enhanced oil recovery. He is exactly right. It is a scam masquerading as a climate solution. And here today, and in this bill, we see all kinds of boosterism for more CO2 pipelines and a lot of other fossil fuel infrastructure. So we can at least agree that supporting CO2 pipelines is a dumb idea, and it's a terrible idea if you care about the climate crisis. Here's another reason you should be skeptical. They're not safe. And that's what this amendment is all about. CO2 has physical properties that present unique safety risks. It has to be transported in multiple phases. It presents a unique challenge to transport and store it safely. Like natural gas, leaks are likely to occur at every stage of the process in this network, from wells to pipelines to compressor stations and storage facilities. But unlike natural gas or crude, CO2 is an asphyxiant, heavier than air, and it doesn't ignite. It can move miles away from a pipeline. Communities can be exposed to harmful levels and have no idea what hit them until it was too late. Now, currently, there's about 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines, mostly in the Permian Basin for enhanced oil recovery. And because of recent incentives that we've created to store and transport CO2, there's a big rush to build a lot more of it. And look, we understand the possible safety risks of concentrated exposure to CO2, but there are still far too many unknowns on how to safely transport and store it. So instead of rushing to help the fossil fuel industry greenwash and achieve more enhanced oil recovery so it can worsen the climate crisis, we ought to be pumping the brakes right now. There are projections that we could see more than 20,000 new miles of CO2 pipelines in the coming decades. And while it's been rare to date and limited to rural areas, we should expect a lot more of this built all over the country and nearer to more populated areas. There's no singular event that highlights the risk more than the Denbury Gulf Coast Pipeline in 2020, which exposed the community of Satartia, Mississippi, to dangerous levels of CO2. Nearly 50 people went to the hospital. PHMSA found that the pipeline company behind this project, Denbury, underestimated the potential size of the affected area, failed to address dangers like landslides in its analysis, did inadequate monitoring, and took too long to notify officials of the explosion. So we know why the fossil fuel industry is rushing to build out all of these CO2 pipelines. They want to continue polluting. They want to do it at taxpayer expense with these new incentives that we created, and then they want to generate a lot of slick ads to tell the world that they take the climate crisis seriously while they're gaslighting all of us. This amendment would at least require that we pump the brakes on CO2 pipelines by having a National Academy of Science comprehensive study on safety issues associated with carbon dioxide pipelines, and this amendment would require the administration to hold its rulemaking until that study is complete. This is the least that we should do. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I do oppose the amendment. There's been several federally sponsored studies that have already been conducted on CO2 pipeline safety issues, and with those already established, I think PHMSA has plenty of information to draw from, and they anticipate issuing a proposed rulemaking on gaseous CO2 in 2024, which was required in the Pipes 2011 Act. With that, I yield back. Are there any further speakers on the amendment? Seeing none, the question, Mr. Perry, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will tell all my colleagues here that I'm interested in the gentleman's amendment, maybe not for the same reasons that he's offering it. I think this whole CO2 thing, as I said, is a boondoggle. Now, if private industry wants to pay for it, this is probably where myself and the gentleman differ, then so be it. But I don't think the taxpayers should be on the hook for any of this stuff. And like I said, I think I have significant disagreements with the gentleman, but I think that in the aggregate, his amendment is dealing with that and knowing more about it and safeguarding our constituents under force of law from paying their taxes to be forced to pay for this or go to jail, I think is something that we should consider. Again, if private industry wants to do this, and this is where I think, respectfully, the gentleman and I would disagree, because I'm for using whatever methods are necessary to get the resources that God has blessed this country with as efficiently, as safely as possible, so that our constituents, our consumers can have access to them at the lowest price point that is safe. I'm for that. And if using these pipelines does that, then I think we would consider that. But at the same time, I don't think it's any business of the federal government to be helping to pay for these things. And probably this is where we could agree, myself and the gentleman, the fossil fuel companies probably make a decent profit and can afford to do these things. And if they want to, then so be it. But here again, the question on my mind is, should our taxpayers be forced to pay for these things? And I resoundingly say where you can't pay for your holiday meal, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or Hanukkah, because you can't afford to. You can't afford your rent. Your credit card bills are out of sight. Adding one more cost to the American people is something that I'm just not willing to entertain at the federal level here. And so I would encourage members to at least consider the gentleman from California's amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Are there any other speakers on the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay.
No.
It appears that the nays have it. The nays do have it. With that, the amendment request recorded. Recorded vote has been requested, and as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Are there any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I've got an amendment to desk number 393.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 393.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment prohibits the administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration from considering or incorporating any social cost of carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. The social cost of carbon statistic has always been dubious at best. It is so dependent upon input decisions that it can easily produce any price at all. And I'm going to prove that momentarily. The situation is made even worse by the decision by both the Obama and Biden administrations to use global cost, in direct contradiction of OMB guidance on cost-benefit analysis. In other words, the social cost of carbon figure is divorced from reality and instead is used as an ideological cudgel to pursue a green agenda at any cost necessary. Any cost necessary. In fact, just this week, the Biden administration released a new social cost of carbon estimate tucked away in the new EPA methane rule, expanding the estimate by almost 4 times to $190 a ton. Just with a stroke of a pen, made up out of thin air, the Biden administration decided that the benefits from these methane regulations are 4 times more valuable than the day before the rule was released. And this invariably will spread to the rest of the federal government. Being able to pencil whip benefits with the use of fake statistics that can be manipulated to produce whatever outcome any administration decides essentially eliminates any value derived from cost-benefit analysis. While this may be appealing to my friends on the other side of the aisle, and quite honestly some on our side, let's think about it in the context before us, which is pipeline safety. If allowed to stand, the benefits from PHMSA rulemaking and regulations will be used on this easily manipulated statistic and nothing else, meaning that the safety benefits or lack thereof can be greatly exaggerated or made to appear where they do not exist to justify regulations that do nothing at all to enhance safety, but threaten industry and kill jobs. In other words, we lose the ability to determine whether there are safety benefits from PHMSA's actions because the justifications behind these regulations are literally falsified. In doing so, we turn the safety regulator into yet another environmental regulator and leave little or no oversight to actual safety. Now let's consider how this applies to some of the novel concepts being enabled in this bill, namely carbon dioxide pipelines as part of the CCS projects and hydrogen blends going into pipes. The benefits of these projects on the social cost of carbon have the potential to outweigh the safety enhancements of any proposed rule, tipping the scales in favor of anything to keep these boondoggle projects going. Now, we should not be basing safety regulations on easily and actively and intentionally falsifiable outcome determinative statistics that are not based in reality. And with that, I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I oppose this amendment. There's a very real cost to all of us from carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. This cost includes many things, including increased respiratory disease in communities with higher rates of emissions. Pipeline operators themselves recognize the cost of emissions as an issue they need to address. They want to keep their product in the pipes. For example, pipeline operator Enbridge itself is committed to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. This amendment would prevent PHMSA from considering reducing childhood asthma rates as a benefit of a new regulation, as for instance. Additionally, the amendment would prevent PHMSA from considering lower utility bills as a benefit of reducing methane leaks from pipelines. There is a benefit. So I would urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I'll yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none. Question is on the amendment by Mr. Perry. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The nays appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I call for a requested recorded vote.
A requested vote has been, or a vote has been requested as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. Mr. Garcia, seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Garcia of Illinois, number 078.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Graves and Nels, Ranking Members Larson and Payne, for all your work to produce a bipartisan Pipes Act. Pipeline safety is especially important as industry looks to dramatically expand our network of carbon dioxide and hydrogen pipelines. While this bill is a starting point for better regulating these types of pipelines, we can and must go further in ensuring that more rigorous safety standards and transparency with communities that are impacted by these pipelines. One way to protect communities is by conducting geohazard mitigation studies to ensure that pipelines are constructed in safe locations where there is little risk of hazards that would strain or damage the pipeline, and to continue to monitor changes to these geographies throughout the lifetime of the pipeline. This amendment broadens the scope of the study on geohazard mitigation in the Pipes Act and adds an evaluation for the need for increased use of geohazard mitigation in pipeline construction, maintenance, and operations. With that said, I recognize the likely fate of a roll call, so, Mr. Chairman, I will withdraw my amendment and yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Boss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk, please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Bost of Illinois, number 052.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Boss, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
My amendment would establish a worker and public safety zone at the location of any pipeline, construction, or pipeline repair operation. Now, this language would strengthen the safety and security of the construction zones around pipelines. Simply the safety zone around, it's like a safety zone around the airport. It simply fixes and will provide the national safety that is required for workers and communities with a scene of the safety and security. And now with that, I understand that there's a question from the administration about this, what this work practice would be, so I would like to request unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment and work with the chair on going forward at a future date.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Boss. Moving on. For what purposes Mr. Molinaro seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Molinaro of New York, number 169.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Molinaro, you have recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment reinforces that airport fuel systems are not under PHMSA's jurisdiction. PHMSA regulates large pipe and interstate transmission systems, not small-scale, low-pressure airport systems. Back in 2010, PHMSA did a study on the safety of airport distribution systems, and in the final report acknowledged there were no safety concerns and that PHMSA does not have authority to regulate on-airport fuel distribution systems. With that said, I do understand that there are some technical concerns with the amendment, and to ensure the Pipes Act is as close to perfection as possible, I will withdraw this amendment and work with the chairman and the ranking member to improve the provision.
Thank you, Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Zell, purpose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Ezell of Mississippi, number 017.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Zell, 5 minutes.
My amendment is a simple one that would improve FSMA's evaluation of existing safety codes. This amendment proposes FSMA consider a modern safety program when evaluating and protecting buildings and outdoor facilities from pipeline safety incidents. The integrity management system has worked well for several years and should be considered when evaluating class locations in the future. Ranking Member Larson, can I have your commitment to ensure that FSMA considers the integrity management system as the process continues?
You have my commitment to work together in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with that, I would like to withdraw my amendment. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Moving on, Mr. Perry. Where's that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 392.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Graves and I were having a conversation here where he couldn't believe that in the holiday spirit I was only offering 4 amendments on this occasion, but I assured him it is indeed true. So, Mr. Chairman, this amendment prohibits the administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration from taking any action pursuant to Executive Order 14096 relating to so-called environmental justice. On theme with other amendments, this amendment prevents the Biden administration from prioritizing ideological pursuits like the Green New Deal and global governance over actual pipeline safety, which is what this administration is all about. Under the guise of so-called environmental justice, the Biden administration has found a way to make its Green New Deal agenda radically divisive and use PHMSA to enforce it. It's not enough to ensure that resources are used to promote environmental stewardship. We must instead fight against the very basis of life on this planet. Life on this planet, which is carbon, which is, take a look around, ladies and gentlemen, every single thing you see, and I mean every single thing you see, including the eyeball you're seeing through, is based on carbon. And to do so, to pursue the Marxist concept of equity, where outcomes are equal rather than opportunities. It is unclear how this furthers PHMSA's mission to protect people and the environment by advancing the safe transportation of energy and other hazardous materials that are essential to our daily lives. In fact, rather than furthering this mission of safety, it detracts from PHMSA's ability to do so by misallocating resources based on the administration's, once again, Green New Deal, one world government agenda. We must put a stop to this irresponsible public policy and ensure that safety remains first and foremost on the minds of those at PHMSA. Those other issues might be important. I'm sure my friends on the other side of the aisle feel they are, and I respect that. But it doesn't belong here. There are agencies completely devoted to those issues, and that's another argument. But if we're focused on safety, which is what I think we should be in this organization, then let's focus on safety. I urge support of this amendment, and I yield the balance.
Thank you,
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I oppose this amendment. Mr. Perry's amendment would prohibit PHMSA from taking any action that would promote environmental justice. Safety can go hand in hand with environmental justice. Ensuring that pipelines are safe, one of PHMSA's goals is to prevent leaks of hazardous liquids or gases and hold pipeline operators accountable for the safety of their pipelines. The safety is intertwined with environmental protection. Every leak or rupture has implications for both public safety and the environment and the impact on people. If adopted, this amendment would prohibit PHMSA from ensuring that certain communities are not disproportionately impacted by the negative impacts of leaking pipes. PHMSA's goal of keeping what's in the pipelines is shared by industry and safety advocates, and this amendment would make it harder for PHMSA to accomplish its core mission. I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. That I yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Are there any amendments to the amendment? We'll move on to vote. The question is on the amendment by Mr. Perry. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I call for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been called. The request for a recorded vote has been called. As previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question are going to be postponed. Mr. Huffman, you have an amendment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk, number
Designate, please.
64.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, number 064, revision 1.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Huffman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On November 17th, an oil spill was discovered by the Coast Guard near the 67-mile-long Main Pass Oil Gathering Company's pipeline system off the coast of Louisiana. We still don't know how much crude oil was released from the pipeline, but it is currently estimated to be about 1.1 million gallons. More than 2 weeks later, we still don't know the cause of that leak. And it would be one thing entirely if this was an isolated incident. However, this is just the latest example of an offshore oil and gas pipeline leak. Other recent incidents include the propane pipeline explosion in Corpus Christi, Texas in 2020, and of course the 2021 leak off Orange County that dumped 25,000 gallons of crude oil into San Pablo Bay. If we're striving for zero oil spills, we are failing. Every day, someplace in America, a pipeline is leaking, spilling, or exploding. And it's for this reason that I urge you to support my amendment. My amendment would put a moratorium on the further build-out of offshore oil and gas pipeline infrastructure until we complete a comprehensive study and analysis by PHMSA and other relevant agencies on the cause of the Main Pass oil gathering pipeline leak and how it could have been prevented. We can't continue with business as usual when pipelines all over this country pose significant risks to our communities every single day. More than 1 million gallons of oil cannot be allowed to leak into the ocean, threatening the livelihoods of our coastal communities without us trying to draw lessons from that accident and insisting on accountability. I urge your support for this amendment and yield back.
Recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment. I do oppose this amendment, given that a moratorium would needlessly and significantly restrict the safe operations of American offshore oil and gas pipeline infrastructure, which is obviously very critical to the United States energy interests and independence. With that, I yield back. Are there any further speakers on the amendment? Mr. Graves, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, look, I certainly appreciate Congressman America's amendment here, attempting to solve problems. Mr. Huffman's my friend. We have nicknames. But let me be clear on something here. What this amendment does is, all right, let me back up just a minute. The reason I call him Congressman America is because he often legislates for areas that are well outside of his state, and so we have a little running joke about that. So now that I've made that comment, let me be clear on the content of this amendment. What this amendment would do is it would say that you cannot allow for any additional pipeline to be constructed in the offshore. Mr. Chairman, the reality is that we need pipelines to transport products, including energy. And so what happens is if you put a moratorium in place that would prevent additional pipelines from being constructed, does that prevent the exploration and production activities? No. What it does, just like we've seen with the genius idea of stopping the pipeline from Canada, the Keystone Pipeline, is what you do is you force alternative means of transportation, okay? You force alternative means of transportation. That means you put the product on trucks. It means you put it on rail. It means you put it on barges or on ships. According to the National Research Council, guess what the safest way to transport products like energy is? Guess what the safest mechanism is? It's through a pipeline. And so let me see if I can say this another way. This amendment would actually force greater threat to the environment. This would actually force greater safety threat. The gentleman, my friend from California, just said that we don't even know what the source of the leak was. We don't. We don't have any idea right now, despite the fact that they have surveyed tens of miles of pipeline, done dives through autonomous vehicles, through divers and everything. We don't know. So here we are prescribing a solution whenever we don't even know what happened. And so let me just say this again. I want to emphasize what the chairman said in regard to his opposition. This amendment doesn't make sense. It doesn't follow science. It doesn't follow safety. It doesn't follow incident reports. Why in the world would we block something that is proven to be the safest way to transport? This is just a crazy amendment that should not be offered today, and I strongly object and urge that we actually follow more science and not less in this case, and do the right thing. So,
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Amendment, sure.
Wouldn't the safest method of transporting energy be kind of transporting those electrons from solar and wind energy projects in a transmission line? I mean, you only get to pipelines being safe and wonderful if you assume we must consume and burn ever greater amounts of fossil fuel, and this amendment only applies to future infrastructure, not existing.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank the gentleman for that question, because that's a really good question that actually further explains this situation. So we could follow as a nation the California model. That's an option that's available to us. We could follow the California model, where my friend represents, that has resulted in the 8th worst emissions growth in America, the most dependent state upon foreign energy, the state that has 1 out of every 6 barrels of oil come from the Ecuadorian rainforest, the state that has double the electricity rates of my home state of Louisiana, the state that has the least reliable grid in America. We could do that. We could. That is an option. I, for one, as the representative of approximately 750,000 people, when hell freezes over, still wouldn't recommend that path, but that is an option. Now, I think what actually makes more sense is actually following the science of the Biden administration's Department of Energy that recognizes that we're going to have an increased demand, not decreased, but increased demand in global demand for oil and gas, and then say, okay, where can we get it where you have the lowest carbon intensity? Guess where that is? In the offshore. Once again, my friend's amendment results in higher emissions, it results in less safe conditions for workers, and it results in a greater threat to the environment. I appreciate my friend continuing to support my points and bring additional support to opposition to this amendment. Once again, Mr. Chairman, I urge opposition to this amendment and yield back.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to speak in opposition. I know my good friend said, well, we were doing so well. Speaking on behalf of, even though I don't get to represent the folks in New England, but I do get to represent 750,000 people in Pennsylvania that would like to see Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale resources be able to get safely to New England, so we wouldn't have to buy, so New England and those states wouldn't have to buy Russian gas to heat their homes and wouldn't have to pay outrageous prices. We would like to be able to be seen, funded, of course, at the expense of the pipeline constructors without taxpayer involvement. We would like to see those resources, American resources, Pennsylvania resources, be able to go to New England so that the people that are in those states that are paying outrageous prices to keep their homes warm, to cook their food, could realize what exists in America at a reasonable price and not have to be embarrassed by supporting Vladimir Putin and Russia by being forced to buy their gas because we can't send it through a pipeline. And the gentleman's amendment will only make that more difficult and make the realization of that eventuality take longer to accomplish. And so, unfortunately, I must oppose the gentleman's amendment. I thank the chairman. I yield the balance.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of the amendment by Mr. Huffman signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it. Gentleman has requested a recorded vote. As previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question will be postponed. Mr. Perry,
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 394, Revision 1.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, recognized for 5
Thank you,
minutes.
Mr. Chairman. This amendment prohibits the administrator of the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration from taking any action pursuant to Executive Orders 13990, 14008, 14030, 14057, and 14082 relating to climate change. Once again, this amendment is about priorities and the proper allocation of resources at PHMSA. Through these executive orders, the administration has sought to address global warming through a whole-of-government approach, ensuring that every agency, regardless of their mission, embraces Biden's radical environmental extremist agenda. Unfortunately, PHMSA is fully bought into this agenda, if being forced to, of course, and continues to misallocate resources to fighting carbon rather than fulfilling its mission to protect people and environment in it by advancing the safe transportation of energy and other hazardous materials that are essential to our daily lives. And that's a quote. That is their mission, to protect people and the environment by advancing the safe transportation of energy and other hazardous materials that are essential to our daily lives. Now, don't take my word for it. PHMSA's Deputy Administrator, Tristan Brown, the highest-ranking Biden administration official at the agency, testified before the subcommittee that, quote, PHMSA has been integral to the whole-of-government approach to mitigating unnecessary greenhouse gas emissions, unquote. This isn't about safety. This is about one world governance and the precepts of the Green New Deal. When the safety regulators disregard their mission, and that's what they're doing, to pursue an ideological agenda, it threatens the safety of our hazardous material transportation system. Plain and simple, when there are the inevitable industry tragedies that injure or take lives, it will be because PHMSA has focused on the Green New Deal instead of safety. And that starts right here in this committee and this markup. Again, this amendment just ensures that PHMSA recommits itself to its safety mission rather than the ideological one world government Green New Deal pursuits of this administration. I urge adoption of this amendment, and I yield the balance.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment?
Chairman.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. PHMSA's mission is to protect people and the environment. Mr. Perry's amendment would prohibit PHMSA from reviewing any actions taken between 2017 and 2020 relating to environmental protection. This amendment would harm PHMSA's ability to advance science-based regulations that are vital to the safety of pipelines. This amendment would unnecessarily tie PHMSA's hands when advancing regulations. I oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to oppose it as well. And I yield back.
Anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment by Mr. Perry. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
The gentleman has requested a recorded vote as previously announced. Pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question are postponed. Mr. Huffman, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, number 065.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Earlier, I shared the example of the carbon dioxide pipeline failure in Satartia, Mississippi, where nearly 50 people were hospitalized after a CO2 leak. This pipeline failure was caused by a landslide, and it was later shown that the pipeline operator, Denbury, failed to address the dangers posed by geological hazards such as landslides. Now, sadly, this is not an isolated incident. It happens all over the country all the time. In March of this year, Highway 101 in my district was forced to close after heavy rainfall caused landslides that exposed a natural gas pipeline very close to the roadway. Local utilities had to work quickly to mitigate a potential disaster. Due to issues caused by geohazards, PHMSA issued advisory bulletins in 2019 and 2022 to operators on geohazard threat mitigation. And currently, PHMSA requires operators to mitigate against geohazard threats within high consequence areas. However, operators do not have to do any specific requirements to mitigate against geohazards outside of these high hazard areas. Neither the CO2 pipeline at Satartia, Mississippi, nor the natural gas pipeline in my district are considered high consequence areas. And yet the potential threat to public safety was still very significant in both cases. My amendment is very simple. It would require operators to include geohazard mitigation in their inspection and maintenance plans, just like they already have to do for high consequence areas. I think this is reasonable, straightforward, and I urge you to join me in making this change. I yield back.
Do other members wish to be heard on the amendment? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. The bill already has a strong safety focus, and I must oppose the amendment as it is duplicative of safety provisions within the underlying bill. We are already examining this issue, With that, I yield back. Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. Mr. Huffman, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it. A vote has been requested. Pursuant to, as previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F, further proceedings on the question are postponed. Mr. Perry, our frequent flyers.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at desk number 395.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, number 395.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Perry, you have recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment simply prohibits PHMSA from taking any action pursuant to the Biden administration's DEI Executive Order 14035. We've litigated both in Congress and at this very committee the immorality and foolishness of this administration's so-called DEI initiatives. Instead of judging people by their individual character, these programs and offices create identity-based divisions based on race, gender, or other immutable factors. Not only is judging an individual based on race immoral, insulting, and illegal, it is a waste of money that distracts federal agencies from their missions. That being said, if the Biden administration wants to push these divisive policies across most of the federal workforce, so be it. I can't stop that. I'm sure our side of the aisle will continue to point out how outrageous they are. However, they have absolutely no place in safety agencies like PHMSA, whose sole mission ought to be ensuring the safe transportation of energy and other hazardous materials not meeting DEI goals. We need to ensure that we have the best people with the relevant knowledge to handle these regulations, period. This amendment ensures PHMSA remains focused on safety and safety alone. I urge support and I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Payne.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. Earlier this year, PHMSA came before this committee to talk about their priorities for reauthorization. One of the top requests was to hire more staff to advance safety rulemakings. This priority that was shared by both parties, and I am pleased that we were able to authorize an additional 30 employees with the funding to match. Recruitment is an ongoing challenge at PHMSA because public service salaries cannot match what industry operators are able to pay their workers. This amendment would make recruitment more difficult by limiting the ability of PHMSA to recruit the best possible pipeline workforce. Further, this amendment could prohibit PHMSA from engaging in outreach to historically black colleges and universities and minority-serving institutes, places where students may not have thought of a career in pipeline safety as a path to protecting the environment and their communities. We should be working to attract more employees to PHMSA and a more diverse workforce at PHMSA, not limiting recruitment efforts. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment. Mr. Perry, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed signify by saying nay.
Nay.
It appears the nays have it.
Mr. Chairman, I got to request it recorded.
A request for a vote on the amendment has been called, as previously announced, pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. Mr. Huffman, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, number 067.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Huffman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As we sit here today, the UN Climate Conference, COP28, is underway. It's a bit of a joke. It's happening in the Petra state of the UAE. The presiding officer is the CEO of a state-owned oil company, and I don't think many of us have high hopes that there will be a lot of bold climate action emerging from this fossil fuel industry extravaganza. But one of the areas that there could be progress on is the effort to curb methane emissions. And we certainly have a team from the United States that's in the UAE right now trying to get more countries to sign on to the global methane pledge. Complementing that, this week EPA issued a final rule on reducing methane emissions, and this new rule will complement previous regulatory efforts now targeting emissions from existing and smaller wells. It will be coordinated with the methane fee that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's generous to call that a methane fee. It's mainly throwing a lot of money at the industry to beg them to reduce their leaks, but I guess at some point it could result in a fee, so we call it a methane fee. In any event, methane is a big deal, and we should be doing a lot more to address it. It is more than 80 times as potent as carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas pollutant. It's estimated that 40% of human-caused methane emissions come from leaks. And further, recent studies are telling us that if you do an honest accounting of all the methane leaks, even just counting small methane leaks and factoring those in, natural gas can be as bad for the climate as coal. So, half of our nation's 3 million miles of natural gas pipelines were built before 1970. That makes the infrastructure prone to leaks. These leaks don't just threaten public health and our environment, but they are a significant source of methane that is spewing every day all over the country through this rickety pipeline network. The good news is that much of the dire impacts due to these emissions from methane leaks are avoidable. There are technologies that can quickly and accurately detect the leaks, they can locate them, and quantify the source of methane leaks. And it's for this reason that I'm putting forward this amendment and would ask all of my colleagues to please seriously consider it. This amendment would require PHMSA to conduct regular fugitive emission monitoring for methane leaks. It will include technologies from stationary ground sensors, remote sensors from automobiles, as well as aircraft and satellites. I urge support for this amendment, which will mitigate damaging methane leakage and at least take a small step toward protecting our climate, health, and the safety of our communities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I recognize myself for 5 minutes to speak on the amendment, and I have to oppose the amendment as PHMSA earlier this year issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on methane leak detection and repair. And it's working through that regulatory process, and I want to ensure that we let all the interested parties weigh in rather than adding further requirements here today and backtracking on that long-awaited rule. With that, I'd yield back. Are there any other speakers on the amendment? Anyone wish to speak to the amendment? Seeing no one, are there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment by Mr. Huffman. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it. The nays do have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Yes. Gentleman requested a recorded vote on the amendment as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. Mr. Huffman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have I think my final amendment at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, number 066.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Huffman, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hydrogen has been a highly incentivized subject, incentivized recently by the industry, which is trying to take advantage of opportunities such as the production tax credit and the Inflation Reduction Act. And there is, of course, a great rush to develop safety standards and keep up with this hydrogen push. Gas operators are already blending hydrogen into existing gas distribution infrastructure, but we do not know exactly who is currently doing this and what percentage of hydrogen they're blending into their systems, because that information and the level of transparency that we ought to have on this subject is not yet required by regulators. A report on blending hydrogen commissioned by the California Public Utilities Commission from University of California, Riverside found an alarming number of safety risks and knowledge gaps. These include the fact that hydrogen has a much higher flammability range than methane, is known to corrode certain types of pipelines, and due to the small size of the molecule, it is prone to leak. And while I'm glad to see that the Pipes Act does include a GAO study on how companies are blending hydrogen into existing natural gas pipelines, with all of the known infrastructure and safety concerns that we already are aware of associated with this practice, it is absolutely crazy that we would continue to allow this practice without completing that study first. And it's for this reason why I submit my amendment for consideration. This amendment would block hydrogen natural gas blending until after the GAO study included in this bill is complete. It will further ensure that this practice can't continue until after there is a rulemaking setting safety standards as informed by the results of the study. Right now, companies are blending hydrogen into pipelines that were never meant to transport hydrogen. We can't afford to wait until an inevitable disaster happens before we step in and address this serious risk. I urge support for my amendment and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be recognized on the amendment? Seeing no one, I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I do oppose this amendment, given that, again, a moratorium would needlessly and significantly restrict the safe operations of American pipeline infrastructure, which are obviously so critical to the United States energy interests and our independence, energy independence. With that, seeing no other speakers on the amendment, is there any amendments to the amendment? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment by Mr. Huffman. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. It appears the nays have it. The gentleman has requested a recorded vote on the amendment as previously announced pursuant to Committee Rule 6F. Further proceedings on the question are postponed. All right. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment, number 81, at the desk.
Please designate.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Garcia of Illinois, number 081.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. This amendment would require the Secretary to present carbon dioxide pipeline dispersion modeling information to a member of the public that requests it. Carbon dioxide pipelines are particularly dangerous because the gas is odorless, which means that in the event of a leak, it is difficult to detect. Currently, there's no odorant available that can be added to the gas, which would stay with the plume in the event of a leak until an odorant is discovered that would identify a CO2 leak. Carbon dioxide could be dispersed widely without detection, which could have dire consequences for nearby communities. Communities and emergency responders have the right to access information about where these pipelines are located and how far and where a plume can travel in the event of an accident. The pipeline rupture in Sartasia, Mississippi, caused 45 people to be hospitalized from CO2 poisoning, but this accident could have been much worse in terms of outcomes. Public access to information keeps people safe, and communities deserve to have the information necessary to keep themselves safe. With that, seeing the dynamic in this markup, I withdraw my amendment and yield back.
Does anyone else wish to be heard on the amendment? I recognize myself for 5 minutes. I have to oppose this amendment as it purports to offer transparency, but at the expense of. What? Did he withdraw it? Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mr. Garcia. Mr. Garcia, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Please designate the amendment.
An amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494, offered by Mr. Garcia of Illinois, number 082.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Mr. Garcia, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. This amendment would require the Secretary to study the safety of blending more than 5% of hydrogen into natural gas pipelines, including to assess the potential risk for increased accidents, leaks, and how to maintain current safety standards. Hydrogen is an extremely explosive element, and blending more than 5% of it into natural gas pipelines that are connected to residential homes is a recipe for disaster if not properly studied and deemed safe. My primary focus on this committee is to keep people safe. Right now, this bill does little to protect people. The first step in improving safety is to study and gather extensive data about the real risks that exist. Until then, we should not proceed with planning how to expand the use of these pipelines, which is what this bill does. With that, and in the spirit of the bipartisanship on this committee, I withdraw my amendment and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. I appreciate that. With that, we have exhausted the amendments. I've been told that there's a markup going on right now in resources. They are voting until 11:45, so we are going to recess until 11:45 and come back and vote. So make sure everybody gets back in the chamber here in the next 10 minutes. So with that, we stand in recess. Is Judiciary, are they done? We'll call the committee back to order. We had a vote in Judiciary as well. I think members are either on their way back or are back. So the committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 6276 as amended. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting of H.R. 6276 as amended to the House of Representatives, which previously passed by a voice vote and which a roll call vote was requested. Is a roll call vote still requested? A roll call vote is still requested.
Hold on, Mr. Perry needs to be recognized out of order.
Mr. Chairman, I request
Sure.
unanimous consent to speak out of order to engage in a colloquy with Mr. Auchincloss regarding this bill.
Without objection,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to speak for Mr. Auchincloss, but we've had a conversation. We know that we're just up for votes right now with some interest that he has in maybe making some subtle changes to the bill. And I've been amenable to having that discussion as it potentially moves to the floor and would now like to engage in a brief colloquy with Mr. Auchincloss.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the chair and ranking member for affording us this opportunity and for Mr. Perry for engaging on this. Here I'm referring to the Use It Act, and specifically, first of all, let me just say that I support the intent and much of the substance of this. I think it is wise to ask for the federal government to be a responsible steward of its leases and to determine what occupancy exists in this new post-COVID employment environment, and then to right-size our office space accordingly. There's just two areas that I'd like to work with Mr. Perry on. One is page 2, line 14, where occupancy is defined according to days per week. I would encourage us to think about that in terms of hours per week, just to reflect the fact that someone may be in person occupying something short of 5 days a week and maybe doing so with a slightly more flexible work arrangement. And then number 2 would be on line 1 of page 3, the term censor. My understanding from the GSA is that they're working on ways to, borrowed from the private sector, to identify occupancy in ways that do not collect PII, in ways that respect civil liberties. And I would just like to further emphasize in the statute here that we expect any kind of censor technology to be one that is highly deferential to people's privacy.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I am interested in working with Mr. Auchincloss to flesh out these potential concerns and, if need be, collaboratively work as it heads to the Rules Committee and to the floor to codify in law what I think we all on both sides of the aisle agree with. And so I'm just stating that publicly, that Mr. Auchincloss and I have had the conversation, willing to work further to come to some consensus if we feel one is necessary as it moves forward. And I appreciate his interest and involvement. And with that, I yield the balance, Mr. Chairman.
All right, a recorded vote has still been requested. Clerk, please call the roll on H.R. 6276 as amended.
Chairman Graves.
Yes, aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson.
No.
Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Carson.
I couldn't hear.
Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost.
Aye.
Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman? Ms. Wilson of Florida? Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne? Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon? Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber?
Aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal? Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton? Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred? Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas? Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois? Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas? Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann? Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss?
Aye.
Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yocum? Mr. Yocum votes aye. Ms. Strickland? Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer? Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. Edwards? Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey? Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes aye. Mrs. Peltola?
No.
Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Mr. Menendez?
No.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon?
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes aye. Mrs. Sykes? Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden? Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton? Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York? Mrs. Fushi? Mr. Molinaro? Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell? Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte? Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida? Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye.
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Webster of Florida? Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson? Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida? Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana? Mr. Williams of New York? Mrs. Fushi?
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Please announce the outcome.
On this vote, there are 35 ayes and 26 nays.
A vote of 35 ayes, 26 nays. The bill as amended is agreed to in order favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 6278. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reported of H.R. 6278 to the House of Representatives, which previously passed by a voice vote in which a roll call vote was requested. Is roll call vote still requested? It is. A recorded vote is still requested. The clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
Aye.
Chairman Graves votes aye. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber.
Aye.
Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes aye. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no, or Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes aye. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes aye. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes aye. Mr. Menendez.
No.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes aye. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Bean of Florida votes aye.
Call the absentees.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? I think we got everyone. Clerk, please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 34 ayes and 29 nays.
I voted 34 ayes, 29 nays. The bill is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The committee previously postponed proceedings on H.R. 6494. The question is now on the amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494 that were previously postponed. First, Amendment number 63, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, on which a recorded vote was ordered. which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested? A recorded vote is still requested. The clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Yes.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSagne. Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Stauber.
No.
Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan.
No.
Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola.
No.
Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez.
No.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Bost.
No.
Mr. Bost votes no.
LaMalfa, no. Can I ask a question, Mr. Chairman?
Let him finish.
Okay.
Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi.
Yes, how did, Babin, how did I vote?
Mr. Babin is recorded as an aye.
Changing that to a nay.
Mr. Babin?
Thank you.
No.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Rouser is recorded as an aye.
Change that to no.
Mr. Rouser votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how is LaMalfa recorded?
Mr. LaMalfa is recorded as an aye.
Please change that to a no.
Mr. LaMalfa votes no.
Any other members wish to change
Do any other
Mr.
members
Chairman?
wish to be recorded?
Chairman, I misspoke. I meant to vote aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Has Mr. Burchett recorded?
I think he's recorded as an I guess so.
Mr. Burchett is recorded as he said he was recorded. Mr. Cohen.
Does anybody else wish to change their vote? Have all members been recorded that wish to be recorded? Clerk, please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 11 ayes and 50 nays.
By a vote of 11 ayes, 50 nays, the amendment is not agreed to. Next, Amendment 393, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still requested? A recorded vote is still requested. The clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser.
Aye.
Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. No. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. No. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. No. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Yes. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. No. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes aye. Ms. Strickland.
No.
Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
No.
Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan?
No.
Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey? Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola?
No.
Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez?
No.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson? Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon?
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James? Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes? Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden? Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton? Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York? Mrs. Fushi? Mr. Molinaro? Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell? Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte? Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida?
Please call the absentees.
Mr. Massey? Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York? Mrs. Fushi? Mr. Bean of Florida?
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? It appears so. Please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 25 ayes and 36 nays.
I voted 25 ayes, 36 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next amendment, 392, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still ordered? It is. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves?
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson? Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford? Mr. Crawford votes aye. Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida? Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano?
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry? Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi? No. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin? Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia? No. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana? Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson? No. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser? Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus? Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost? Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman? Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa? Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee? Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman? Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida? Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast? Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne? No. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon? Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber? Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal? No. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett? Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton? No. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota? Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred? No. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew? Yes. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas? Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois? Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas? Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas? Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann? Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton? Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens? Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss? Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum? Mr. Yocum votes aye. Ms. Strickland?
No.
Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer? Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana.
No.
Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan.
No.
Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. No. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez.
No.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Let's call the absentees.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded? Please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 26 ayes and 35 nays.
A vote of 26 ayes, 35 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next, amendment number 64, revision 1, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still ordered? It is.
No, Mr. Chairman, if you give me a moment to speak out of order, we may be able to speed things along.
Absolutely.
I appreciate that very much. This, of course, is an amendment that would put a moratorium on new offshore serving pipelines until we get to the bottom of the recent oil spill on the Louisiana coast. Obviously, I think we should be pumping the brakes on all fossil fuel infrastructure right now. But at the very least, we should set very high safety standards in the wake of a spill like this before we go further. Now, I believe that my colleague from the Louisiana coast, Mr. Carter, shares my concern about getting a quick answer to what happened with this particular spill and trying to incorporate the lessons learned into future rulemaking and safety standards. And so if the gentleman will agree to work with me, given that this amendment, could maybe not pass, I'd be happy to work with the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hoffman, thank you very much. Listen, I agree with you that we have to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. We have to pivot to a cleaner, greener source of energy. And I certainly share your views and your concerns as it relates to the oil leaks, particularly in my district, but across the country. And clearly, we have to do something better and have better safety standards. I'm not certain that this measure is the most effective way to do that, and I would love to work with you if you're willing to pull this and spend some time with me and my colleague, Mr. Graves from Louisiana, on coming up with some alternative measures on how we might accomplish the mission.
And I will accept that despite the fact that it requires me to spend more time with Mr. Graves from Louisiana.
Don't make it worse.
Thank you, sir.
I'll withdraw that.
Ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment. Agreed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Moving on. Next, Amendment 394, Revision 1, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, in which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still ordered? It is still ordered. The clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
No.
Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi.
No.
Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
No.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes aye. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. Diaz-Posito. Mr. Diaz-Posito votes no. Mr. Menendez.
Nope.
Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida. Mr. Massey. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Has everyone been recorded who wishes to be recorded? Please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 23 ayes and 39 nays.
A vote of 23 ayes, 39 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next, amendment number 65, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, which a recorded vote was ordered, which was not agreed to by voice vote, is a recorded vote still ordered. It is. Please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. No. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Yes.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen.
I should have voted yes.
Yes. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Yes.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes aye. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes aye. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes aye. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez.
Yes.
Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
Yes.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes aye. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezel. Mr. Ezel votes no. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Call the absentees.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Williams of New York. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Do all members wish to be recorded?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I intended to vote aye on Hoffman 65.
Ms. Norton votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to change my vote to a no.
Sorry, with the, Mr. Payne votes no.
Anyone else wish to change their vote? All members who wish to be recorded, are you recorded? Please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 20 ayes and 42 nays.
A vote of 20 ayes, 42 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next is Amendment 395, offered by Mr. Perry of Pennsylvania, in which a recorded vote was ordered and which was not agreed to by voice vote. As a recorded vote still ordered, it is. Clerk, please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano.
No.
Mrs. Napolitano votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes no. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes aye. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes aye. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes aye. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes aye. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes no. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes aye. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes no. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes no. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes aye. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes aye. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes aye. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes aye. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes aye. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes no. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes aye. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes aye. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes aye. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes aye. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-Dreamer. Mrs. Chavez-Dreamer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes aye. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
No.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes no. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes aye. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes no. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes aye. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes aye. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I meant to vote aye. I think I was recorded. Crawford, aye.
Mr. Crawford votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded? Westerman?
Oh, Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman is recorded as a no.
Aye.
Mr. Westerman votes aye.
Call the absentees.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Williams of New York. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Does anyone else wish to change their vote? Has everybody been recorded that wants to be recorded? Please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 25 ayes and 37 nays.
I voted 25 ayes, 37 noes. The amendment is not agreed to. Next, Amendment 67, offered by Mr. Huffman of California, in which a recorded vote was ordered and which was not agreed to by voice vote. Is a recorded vote still ordered? It is. Please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Ranking Member Larson. Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
Aye.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi.
Yes.
Mr. Garamendi votes aye. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Would the member please repeat? Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes aye. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes aye. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes aye. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter of Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes aye. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
Aye.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes aye. Mr. Williams in New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Call the absentees.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Williams in New York. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded?
Mr. Chair, how is Sykes recorded?
Mrs. Sykes is recorded as a no.
Mr. Chair, can I change the vote to a yes?
Mrs. Sykes votes aye.
Does anyone else wish to change their vote? Ms. Titus.
How am I recorded?
Ms. Titus is recorded as a no.
I changed that to yes.
Ms. Titus votes aye.
Anyone else wish to change? Announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 21 ayes and 41 nays.
I voted 21 ayes, 41 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. Next, amendment number 66, offered by Mr. Huffman in California, in which a recorded vote was ordered and which was not agreed to by voice vote. As a recorded vote still requested, it is. Please call the roll.
Chairman Graves.
No.
Chairman Graves votes no. Mr. Ranking Member Larson.
No.
Ranking Member Larson votes no. Mr. Crawford. No. Mr. Crawford votes no. Ms. Norton.
Yes.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Webster of Florida. Mr. Webster of Florida votes no. Mrs. Napolitano.
Aye.
Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Mr. Massey. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Perry. Mr. Perry votes no. Mr. Garamendi. Mr. Garamendi votes no. Mr. Babin. Mr. Babin votes no. Mr. Johnson of Georgia. Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes no. Mr. Graves of Louisiana. Mr. Graves of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Carson. Mr. Carson votes no. Mr. Rouser. Mr. Rouser votes no. Ms. Titus. Ms. Titus votes no. Mr. Bost. Mr. Bost votes no. Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman votes aye. Mr. LaMalfa. Mr. LaMalfa votes no. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee votes aye. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman votes no. Ms. Wilson of Florida. Ms. Wilson of Florida votes aye. Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast votes no. Mr. Payne. Mr. Payne votes no. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon. Mrs. Gonzalez-Colon votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier. Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Stauber. Mr. Stauber votes no. Mr. Carbajal. Mr. Carbajal votes no. Mr. Burchett. Mr. Burchett votes no. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton votes no. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota votes no. Mr. Allred. Mr. Allred votes no. Mr. Van Drew. Ms. Davids of Kansas. Ms. Davids of Kansas votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Nels votes no. Mr. Garcia of Illinois. Mr. Garcia of Illinois votes aye. Mr. Gooden of Texas. Mr. Gooden of Texas votes no. Mr. Pappas. Mr. Pappas votes no. Mr. Mann. Mr. Mann votes no. Mr. Moulton. Mr. Moulton votes no. Mr. Owens. Mr. Owens votes no. Mr. Auchincloss. Mr. Auchincloss votes no. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum votes no. Ms. Strickland. Ms. Strickland votes no. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer. Mrs. Chavez-DeRemer votes no. Mr. Carter, Louisiana. Mr. Carter of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards votes no. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan votes no. Mr. Kane of New Jersey. Mr. Kane of New Jersey votes no. Mrs. Peltola. Mrs. Peltola votes no. Mr. D'Esposito. Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez votes no. Mr. Burleson. Mr. Burleson votes no. Ms. Hoyle of Oregon.
Aye.
Ms. Hoyle of Oregon votes aye. Mr. James. Mr. James votes no. Mrs. Sykes. Mrs. Sykes votes no. Mr. Van Orden. Mr. Van Orden votes no. Ms. Skolton. Ms. Skolton votes no. Mr. Williams of New York. Mrs. Fushi. Mrs. Fushi votes aye. Mr. Molinaro. Mr. Molinaro votes no. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Ezell. Mr. Ezell votes no. Mr. Duarte. Mr. Duarte votes no. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Call the absentees.
Mr. Massey. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no.
I'm sorry, what?
Mr. Williams of New York. Mr. Bean of Florida.
Have all members been recorded who wish to be recorded?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded on that vote?
Mr. Johnson of Georgia is recorded as a no.
I wish to change my vote to yes.
Mr. Johnson votes aye.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Ms. Titus is recorded as a no.
I would change that to a yes.
Ms. Titus votes aye.
Anyone else wish to change their vote? Seeing no one, please announce the vote.
On this vote, there are 11 ayes and 51 nays.
By a vote of 11 ayes, 51 nays, the amendment is not agreed to. The question is now on the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6494 as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. The question is now on the adoption of and favorably reporting as 6494 as amended to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed signify by saying nay. The ayes have it. The bill as amended is agreed to and ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Ms. Vendry.
There was no report. We just passed the bill. Yep. Right. I just need you to read this last piece so that you can go.
You got to finish up.
Well, you do it.
I'll see you later.
Oh, yeah. Thank you all for participating in today's markup. I'd ask unanimous consent that each measure ordered reported today be reported as a single amendment, in the nature of a substitute, incorporating all amendments adopted without objection. That is so ordered. And I'd ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make all necessary technical, clarifying, and conforming changes to each of the measures ordered, reported today, and reflect the actions of the House without objection. That is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 22, Clause 1, I ask unanimous consent that the chairman of his or his designee be authorized to offer such amendments, such motions as may be necessary in the House to go to conference with the Senate on the legislation adopted today or any similar measure. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman, after consultation with the ranking member, have authority to strike or revise any provision of the measures reported today that may cause a sequential referral to another committee or would cause the bill to be subject to the Budget Act or Rule 21, cut-go, point of order. Without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I'd ask unanimous consent that all members of the committee have at least 2 calendar days in which to file any supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views on the legislation, which that is so, without objection, that is so ordered. Pursuant to Rule 6 of the Rules of the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, I note the presence of a quorum for all actions on all committee business today. And with that, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure has completed its business. The committee is now adjourned.